We've got a live chat from Ruslan KD, who is a Christian YouTuber. He's one of the chaps, actually, that did what I was talking about a second ago.
Pause it. It's Ruslan KD, Alex. Famous atheist turned agnostic YouTuber Alex O'Connor called me out for this, but then made one critical mistake. On his recent 11-hour live stream celebrating reaching 1 million subscribers, I wanted to pop into the chat and say hello, but it quickly turned left when he recognized my username. In this video, I'll show you exactly what he roasted me for, take a little bit of ownership, and unpack the crazy claim he made subsequently that, in his view, debunks the claims of the gospel. But before we get into that, guys, my name is Ruslan. This channel exists to encourage, empower, and inspire you to live a life that blesses God. Sometimes that requires us to push the line a little bit and engage with people from different worldviews. So if you're new here or if you're not new here, do me a favor, make sure to hit that subscribe button. There's a huge percentage of the people who watch this channel, unfortunately, are not subscribed. All right, let's jump into this video. In his 1 million subscriber stream, I was tuning in, and I asked him to give me a steel man of his view of why Christians reject the gospel of Thomas.
Yes.
In his lack of explaining that, he accused me of something. Let's look at what Alex had to say. Check this out.
Live chats. We've got a live chat from Ruslan KD.
Pause it. It's Ruslan KD, Alex.
Should do the drop. Ruslan.
Ruslan.
So I sent him a super chat because I watch Alex. I'm like, man, 1 million subscribers is a huge feat. I'm super happy for him.
He's a cool dude.
He's a
Great
cool
creator.
dude. Seems like a cool creator. I think he has done us a huge service in the last year. He softened his tone on Christianity. I love it. He just had a great conversation with Ayan Hershey Ali that we reacted to. He's had a great conversation with Jordan Peterson. He moderated Jordan Peterson Richard Dawkins debate. I've genuinely been appreciating Alex and his work. Now he's going to accuse us of something.
A Christian YouTuber. He's one of the chaps, actually, that did what I was talking about a second ago. That said, I can't remember, what was it that they were reacting to? The Destiny thing. The sort of Alex announces that he's a Christian or that he's a theist or something, which I don't think I did in that stream. I did not do that. No, the false title, my friend.
He said that was a false title, my friend.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Zach. You cook.
Okay. So first of all, Alex O'Connor sits with Destiny and says, you don't believe God exists. And Destiny says, F no. Alex O'Connor, with a softened heart towards God, begins to say, you don't think so. And he goes on to explain how he believes a version of God probably exists.
Pull up what you titled the video, which, by the way, I'll take it on the chin. If Alex feels like the video was wrong,
We'll change it.
we'll change it. So this is what the video is actually titled. Did famous atheist Alex O'Connor announce he believes in God?
I didn't say you were a theist. Didn't say you were a Christian. I just said, did you announce that you believe God exists? Maybe I could change it to a God exists or a type of God exists. So I don't feel like that was clickbait, and I felt like, and I don't feel like that was saying that he's saying he's Christian. Although 3 weeks in hindsight, looking at it now, there's crosses on the thumbnail, and you know, as an artist, we have some liberties. Okay,
God is being itself. So God is.
God, cringe.
So you know when
Listen, so Alex, look at the way Destiny is reacting to this.
Yeah.
Clearly, you are presenting some form of God to him.
Hello.
That you have evolved on. So it is not unreasonable for people to say, did Alex's view on what a God is or God shift based on your fellow atheists' utter disgust with the question and the way you're positioning this?
Yellowstone for years was exhibiting signs of volcanic activity, and scientists spent decades trying to find the volcano. They were looking around Yellowstone Park. They're like, we see volcanic activity.
Yep.
Where's the volcano? They're searching through Yellowstone.
So as a metaphor, we see all the volcanic activity, but we can't find the volcano. Punchline.
Wait, he's finishing last thought.
They finally realize they're looking for the volcano everywhere, and then at some point they suddenly realize, it dawns on them, the park, the whole thing is the volcano. That is analogous to us looking around the world. Where's God? Is he under this thing? Is he in the microscope? Oh, like, is he going to be at the
Yeah,
end?
I understand. That's real deep. Yeah.
I don't know. I
was
say
a little wild with the thumbnail.
You were a little wild. You were a little wild with the thumbnail. I would say that the idea that the universe is God is neither an agnostic or an atheist position. Having said that, I understand what Alex is saying, and I think it's a fair critique. And we fight about this stuff all the time. Zach, if you guys don't know, I don't title stuff, and we usually have to reel Zach in. Chris told Zach this. And the way he gets away with it is by changing the title to a question. So if he makes a claim, we go, you can't say that. You got to change it to a question.
So it's like Alex O'Connor announces he believes in God.
Can't say that.
Can't say it, but you can say,
did Alex O'Connor
announces he believes in God?
Right. What he then does when I ask him to steelman why the Gospel of Thomas didn't make it into the Bible, he steps into he makes it worse, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, can you steelman why the Gospel of Thomas was not canonized as scripture?
8 seconds.
Now this is an ongoing joke because all he wants to talk about is the Gospel of Thomas.
Secondary.
Yeah. Well, one answer is that it was written later, probably.
Pause it. Lord just shutting that stream down.
Yeah.
Oh man, go ahead.
There are some people, I think, who believe that the Gospel of Thomas is like as early as Mark.
Anybody who knows anything about the Gospel of Thomas knows that it is a Gnostic forgery. 250 AD.
It's dated from like
Earlier.
Yeah, from like 40 or 50 all the way up to like 200
30
AD,
or
or like 100, 180 or something. I'm not an expert in dating texts, I don't know. But the thing about the Gospel of Thomas, it's a sayings gospel. So it just has the sayings of Jesus. It's not a narrative.
He described a version of God that sounded like pantheism or Eastern religion. And so the Gospel of Thomas gives him that out to say, I'm not a theist, but I think there's something out there, potentially. I can't know what it is, but there's energies and forces.
Yeah.
Gospel of Thomas gives him that. It gives him a God without any authority. It gives him a God without any order. It gives him a God without any commands. It gives him a God that he can make in his image. I think, my opinion, I don't know. And I believe this is, in my opinion, potentially, maybe, I don't know, the work of the Holy Spirit to this pantheism. That is what I think is happening. So he doesn't want the God of the Bible, even though he likes the Christian story. He wants a God that he can make in his own image, which is the universe.
If it's early, then there's something about the content of the quotes that were felt unfit to be part of the scriptural tradition by the church who finally formalized the New Testament. If it's late, then it might just be because it's late that it sort of didn't make it in. It is also filled with weird theology. It's filled with a different kind of theology to the other gospels. So if there is a Christian orthodoxy developing around the bodily resurrection of Jesus and the physicality of that resurrection and the importance of believing in that resurrection as a mode
because the
of
Gospel of
salvation.
Thomas doesn't teach a physical bodily resurrection. This is what Jordan Peterson corrected him about. That's Gnosticism. Jordan Peterson, when he asked him, do you believe that Jesus bodily rose? He says, I suppose so. I would suppose yes, right? And then he corrected him about his Gnosticism. Go back and watch that conversation.
And of course, Paul's letters are really early, and they're pretty heavy on their theology. The Gospel of Thomas is opposed to that. So I'd imagine that it might just be theological reasons that it was cut out. The Gnostic Gospels focus on gnosis, on knowledge. It's much more about knowing the right kind of thing, and that's what brings you salvation, not believing in the bodily resurrection of Jesus. In fact, the resurrection isn't even in the Gospel of Thomas. It's not in a lot of the Gnostic Gospels because they didn't think it was important. So an early Christian who believes that they are saved thanks to the sacrifice of Jesus are going to look at this Gospel and go it's firstly, it's probably theological nonsense, and secondly, it doesn't tell us the most important thing. Which
and
is
most importantly, the dates are off. Most importantly, you're way off on the dates. It's nowhere near the Gospel of Mark. But instead of relying on Google to explain why the Gospel of Thomas is non-canonical and why it was appropriated by a specific group at a much later date for their own personal gain, I decided to reach out to Wes Huff, a historian and manuscript expert who recently did us the pleasure of taking down Billy Carson in a debate.
So I've had the unique pleasure to actually work with the actual manuscripts of the Gospel of Thomas. We have 4 manuscripts that exist. The 3 earliest are Greek fragments that come from the Egyptian city of Oxyrhynchus and include only fragmentary sections of the Gospel of Thomas. But the most famous one is the 4th century copy written in Coptic, which was part of the Nag Hammadi Codex II. And I have actually had the pleasure of going to the Coptic Museum in Cairo and actually analyzing and translating the actual document of the Gospel of Thomas as it exists in its final form in Coptic. Now, one of the reasons why I think we can talk about the dating of Thomas being later is because when we compare the earlier Greek manuscripts that come from Oxyrhynchus to the later manuscript, although the earlier fragments only contain about 20% of the later Thomas that comes from the 4th century. When all 4 manuscripts are examined, there is a notable textual difference between the full Coptic version and our 3 Greek fragments. So much so that there appears to have been a remarkable change between the earlier copies we have in Greek and the later version in Coptic. So unlike minor variations that we see within the text of the New Testament in Greek in those manuscripts, our copies of Thomas have enough overlap to point to them being the same document, but the content has clearly adapted over what could arguably say 140 years. So with these early fragments come from the 2nd century, but they even show content that is still a kind of shadow of what the specific ideological view that we would call Gnosticism includes. And they even include ideas that we know did not come into and were incorporated into what we would refer to as Christian Gnosticism until the 2nd century. So right off the bat, the Gospel of Thomas identifies the writer as Didymus Thomas Judas. Now, the author of Thomas clearly didn't know that the name Thomas and the term in Greek Didymus are the same thing. They both mean twin. So the author of the Gospel of Thomas must have not known that the name of the evangelist, the disciple Thomas, was the same thing as saying Didymus. So it could not have been the Thomas of the Bible, because the author clearly doesn't know what their name even means, which is a red flag. We also see other areas in Logion 28, which is included in P-Oxy 1, which is one of these early Greek fragments. It says that Jesus appeared to them in the flesh, but unlike John's gospel at the Gospel of John 1:14, that says the word became flesh, the Greek word ageneto, the Gospel of Thomas uses the word ophtein, which means appeared. And this kind of plays into this idea that these later groups that incorporated Jesus within their philosophical theology, which was much more pagan than it was early Jewish or Christian, they had this idea that the physical was evil and the spiritual was good. And so they really capitalized on Jesus not actually being a physical person, but appearing to be a physical person. And we get this in hints in these early fragments of the Gospel of Thomas. There are red flags that indicate that this was much later. The final version of the Gospel of Thomas, likewise, it relies on, for its base content, the previous canonical Gospels. So there's clear source dependence from the Gospel of Thomas on the previous books of the Gospels. In fact, there are outright either connections linguistically in terms of what it appears to be quoting and paraphrasing with 16 of the 27 documents of the New Testament. So I think we simply need to ask the question. We have this Jesus portrayed in a document like the Gospel of Thomas, which portrays Jesus much more like a Gentile pagan mystic. Well, is it more likely that Jesus, being a 1st century Jew living in Galilee, raised in Nazareth, doing work in Jerusalem, in Roman occupied Judea, is it more likely that he was a Jew that later groups try to paint as a pagan mystic? Or was he originally a pagan mystic who then, for some reason or other, is then portrayed as a Jewish rabbi? Well, I think the Jewish rabbi original theory is far more likely, especially when we look at the fact that the Gospel of Thomas, its content doesn't appear to be coming from 1st century Roman occupied Judea. It has shadows and echoes of later developments theologically, linguistically. It has some elements of Syriac tradition within its text that comes at a later point in time within Christian history. And so there are a number of factors that, even though I think we can say the Gospel of Thomas is early, 2nd century, arguably the earliest of these apocryphal proto-Gnostic Gospels, I still think the data of evidence is unanimously both in terms of the manuscript evidence and in terms of the content pointing to this being written at a time and at a place when the Thomas that is supposedly its author was long dead.
Wow. So you said that it sounds like the Gospel of Thomas is almost self-falsified because of the Didymus twin line. Is that accurate? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, so there are a number of things that, if you read the biblical gospels, you'll notice that if you took out that title, "The Gospel According to," you wouldn't necessarily know who the author is, and that's sometimes referred to as formal anonymity. Now, I think the titles were always there from the beginning, but what we see in these later documents, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Philip, is they're really trying to establish a level of credibility that I don't think they internally hold. So they do things like start off in saying, like, I, Thomas, wrote these secret sayings down, which the Lord Jesus Christ told me. Or in the Gospel of Peter does the exact same thing. At the beginning and at the end, it reminds you, hey, I am Peter, I wrote this. In the very end, it says, I'm Peter, I wrote this. And the reason for that is because the biblical Gospels, the focus and credibility and authority comes from Jesus. So the fact that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John happen to write it is a secondary fact, whereas these later documents do not possess the credibility. And so they're trying to shoehorn in a credibility they don't actually possess by making sure, oh, hey, I'm Thomas. Remember me, Thomas, the disciple? That's something that we don't find in the biblical Gospels, because the biblical Gospels are far more concerned with giving you an accurate portrayal of Jesus rather than trying to appropriate Jesus and kidnap a level of credibility they don't intrinsically have.
Okay, another claim that Alex made was that some scholars believe the Gospel of Thomas predates the Gospel of Mark. And I have never heard of this. Is there any validity to this claim?
Yeah, so I would say that the number of scholars who are actually within this field of like New Testament scholarship, historiography, even manuscript analysis, that think that Thomas is earlier than the biblical Gospels, I could probably count on two hands. So it's not that there aren't scholars who advocate for this, but it is a very small minority view. And most of the time, if you look at individuals like Elaine Pagels or others who advocate for the early gospel in terms of the Gospel of Thomas predating the biblical ones, it usually has less to do with the actual content and more to do with the form that the Gospel of Thomas comes in. Because the Gospel of Thomas is not a gospel as you and I, Ruslan, would think of it in terms of Jesus's birth, life, death, resurrection, right? There's a narrative structure to it. The Gospel of Thomas falls into a category of what are referred to as sayings gospels. The Gospel of Thomas is 114 sayings of Jesus. And so part of the argument is saying that this is a more primitive version of kind of gospel literature in terms of the sayings of Jesus Christ. And so it's the form and the function of the actual way that the document is outlined more than its actual content. There are a few places where they would refer to the content and try to make an argument for its kind of a primitive early aspect predating the Gospels. But the bulk of the argument is not actually on what Thomas is saying. It's on actually the way that it's written.
Got it. And so where would you place in the scholarly consensus on when the Gospel of Thomas was likely written?
Yeah, I mean, the Gospel of Thomas is almost certainly written in the 2nd century. Dating with these things is very tricky because they don't come with dates. And so when we date a document, there are ways that we do it in terms of, we can look at the manuscripts and analyze the text in what's called paleography, which is kind of the analyzation of handwriting. We can carbon date manuscripts, and we can do chemical ink analysis on the actual writing. And then you do internal analysis to try to figure out when the time frame that something came from is internal and external analysis. Now, those are all not bulletproof. And so whether we're talking about the biblical Gospels or we're talking about the Gospel of Thomas, there are different aspects of, we're probably looking more at a window. So I think it's safe to say that the Gospel of Thomas comes from the 2nd century. There was actually a fragment that was just published last year by the Egyptian Exploration Society that comes once again from this city that I've been to in Egypt, Oxyrhynchus. And this fragment, P-Oxy 5575, included a number of sayings from the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Matthew, and what appears to be some sayings that could have originated from the Gospel of Thomas. Now, the jury is out on that one, but if we include this fragment in the kind of collection of the overt Gospel of Thomas fragments, this one has been dated in and around the first half of the 2nd century. But even then, it doesn't necessarily kind of redate Thomas in any way. We're still talking about whenever the Gospel of Thomas is coming around, it's somewhere in between, the year probably. I mean, I'm hesitant to put a round date on it, but in that beginning half of the 2nd century. However, I think it's safe to say it's more likely in the middle to, if we're going to talk about 250, 260, 270, I think that's a much safer place to put the Gospel of Thomas, especially in terms of the manuscripts that we find in Oxyrhynchus and how their content appears to give us indications of their dating.
And why would the canonical Gospels be viewed as closer to the time of Jesus and the apostles? Like, what is the evidence there in terms of saying, no, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we believe predate the Gospel of Thomas by a lot? What would you say the evidence is and the consensus is on that?
Yeah, so I think unanimously, when we're talking about the canonical Gospels, we're talking about the 1st century. And so we can argue about whether we think that is earlier in the 1st century or later in the 1st century. I think actually scholarship is growing more in the direction of saying that, especially Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not only are they pre-70, but they're actually relatively comfortably pre-70. That kind of round date is because in 70 AD, Jerusalem was sacked by Rome and the temple was destroyed. So it becomes this kind of tidy date that we kind of date things in the 1st century. Does it predate 70 or does it post-date 70? And I think when we're looking at the internal content of the Gospels, what we see very comfortably is something that is coming, that is being written by individuals who were in 1st century Judea. We can look at the geography. We can look at things like name frequency, which is sometimes called onomastic congruence, which is just a big long word that means name frequency. So we know that certain popular names were popular within particular decades of particular geographical areas, and that's not true for later documents. So for example, the Gospels and Acts get the names right for the areas that they claim to be writing in, especially when they start to give disambiguators with names, right? You see Jesus of Nazareth, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary, the sister of Martha, Mary Magdalene. It's because these are popular names. So when you're talking about Mary or Peter or Jesus, you need to make sure you know which one you're talking about. We know that those names were popular in 1st century Galilee, Judea, and those surrounding areas. And so it makes sense for them to disambiguate them in that way. Now, this is, we can actually do this with the other documents too. The Gospel of Judas uses background characters, and it names names that were not popular in 1st century Judea and Galilee, but names that were popular in 2nd and 3rd century Egypt. And so that's a kind of an indication, at minimum, that kind of gives us a clue that this was probably written in the 2nd or 3rd century in Egypt. And that's exactly what happens with the Gospel of Judas. So you can look at things like name frequency, you can look at things like geography, you can look at things like kind of the clues that the gospel authors are giving you. And then you can look at external factors, like the fact that we have a group of individuals within the early church who we refer to as the Apostolic Fathers. And the Apostolic Fathers are a group of early Christian writers, some of whom knew the disciples themselves. So Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, Papias of Hierapolis. These are individuals who Jesus had his disciples, and these are the disciples of the disciples. And they tell us about the Gospels. They tell us about the Gospel authors. Papias even tells us, Papias, Polycarp, Ignatius give us some clues and indications that Mark was a traveling companion of Peter and knew Peter personally. Ignatius knew both Peter and John. Clement knew Peter and Paul. Polycarp knew John. Papias knew John. And so you have these individuals who can actually, they lived within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses of Jesus, and they are telling us about the books that were handed down to them from the apostles. So in the whole conversation about, okay, what is biblically canonical? What do we include in that list of books that we have in our New Testament? Well, a big part of that conversation is the fact that you had individuals who carry a direct chain of custody and line of succession to the earliest Jesus community themselves, who knew Jesus' disciples and can comment on them. So we can look at internally the content of the Gospels and say, this is unanimously for the 1st century. This is almost certainly within the time frame that the Gospels are being written in by people who were If they weren't there, they were communicating with people who were there, which is exactly what we see at the beginning of Luke's gospel, right? He says he's not an eyewitness, but he is interviewing eyewitnesses. And so we have these indications, whereas when we use the same criteria and methodology for the Gospel of Thomas, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, they actually reveal the opposite is true. They're not being written in the place they claim to be written in. They're not being written in the time frame, and they have all of these little indicators that place them in later decades and centuries when we know that the individuals associated with their names, Peter, Judas, Paul, Mary, Philip, were long dead.
Wow. Wesley, you are such a well of information on this stuff. We're going to link your website and some of the articles you've actually written about this, and as well as your YouTube. So thank you for the work you do on this, man. This is incredible stuff, and I'm grateful to have access to an actual historian and textual expert on this sort of stuff. So thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, always a pleasure. Love to chat about it.
Hey, thank you so much for checking out the video. Please be sure to comment below and subscribe and all that good stuff. And check out this other video that YouTube seems to be recommending just for you. Let me know if they nailed it. All right, I'll see you over there. Peace.